One of the events that sparks the most heated discussions in Venezuela and New Granada is the separation of Venezuela from the so-called Gran Colombia. The disintegration of what was envisioned as a powerful state in South America, made up of present-day Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama, was much more than just a simple territorial fragmentation. A story full of great aspirations, intrigues, governmental problems, and social conflicts. Among its main characters are Generals Simón Bolívar, Francisco de Paula Santander, José Antonio Páez, and many other men who either longed for or rejected the project of a great nation that would shape the destiny of this region. Was this also the birth and founding of the current Republic of Venezuela and consequently of the current Republic of Colombia? Join us to learn about the history of Gran Colombia and the movement that led to its separation and the beginning of a new era. To talk about the history of Gran Colombia, we first need to make several clarifications. The first of these is that Gran Colombia was actually called the Republic of Colombia. The term Gran Colombia was later created by historians to refer to that state which existed from 1819 to 1831, and it was the geographic, military, and political administrative union of the former Captaincy General of Venezuela. The Viceroyalty of New Granada and the provinces of Quito and Guayaquil, and in this way, to be able to differentiate that state from the current Republic of Colombia that we know today. Secondly, Gran Colombia did not owe its name to the current Republic of Colombia, since at that time that territory existed under the name of the Viceroyalty of New Granada. But once the Republic of Colombia was created and later dissolved, originally in 1831, the Republic of New Granada emerged in that territory, which, amid internal conflicts, several decades later, in 1863, changed its name to the United States of Colombia, and then in 1886, that's when it came to be called the current Republic of Colombia. So what we know today as Colombia uses its name from that old Republic of Colombia, even though that name symbolized New Granada and Quito. Thirdly, both the flag and the very name used by Gran Colombia were the product of the mind of a Venezuelan. Francisco de Miranda, Colombia, or Colombella, was the name that Miranda had come up with in 1783 in his project for the emancipation of the American continent. This honored Christopher Columbus, based on the idea that the old Spanish Empire would become the new empire of the Americans or Colombians, which for him meant the same thing. In turn, the tricolor flag, which would be adopted by Gran Colombia and the three countries that emerged after its dissolution. It was raised for the first time in history in August 1806 on the coast of the city of Coro by Francisco de Miranda himself during his expeditions in those years. Therefore, the flag, the emblem, and the project of the Union of Colombia are Venezuelan creations that originated in the mind of Francisco de Miranda. They evolved and materialized in their own way with the sword of the liberator, Simón Bolívar, and the other leaders of the War of Independence. So let's now talk about how that Gran Colombia emerged and about the events that led to Venezuela's separatist tendency. The liberator first envisions Colombia as a union of Venezuela and New Granada, later including Quito. During the first years of the War of Independence, when Simón Bolívar saw how both nations were losing amid anarchy and civil discord, the independence they had recently proclaimed, he decided it was necessary to unite them as a single country and thus consolidate a union that would allow them to defend themselves and expel the royalists from the continent. This is reflected for the first time when he leaves Caracas for Cartagena after the fall of the First Republic of Venezuela. And in December 1812, he publishes his famous Cartagena Manifesto, In that document, Bolivar points out that it is essential for the security of New Granada and the reconquest of Caracas. And he states that the royalists would do everything in their power to take over. I quote, "the seeds and even the roots of the tree of liberty of Colombia," end quote. Therefore, he ends by saying, "the honor of New Granada imperatively demands punishing those daring invaders, pursuing them to their last strongholds as its glory. It also depends on taking charge of the endeavor. To march to Venezuela to liberate the cradle of Colombian independence, its martyrs, and that worthy people of Caracas." And indeed, during 1813, Bolivar, with the support of the Congress of New Granada, liberated the Magdalena River, entered Venezuela through San Antonio del Táchira, climbed the Andean peaks, proclaimed the controversial war to the death, defeated the enemy, and entered Caracas in triumph on August 6th. Then, in the same year, 1813, he wrote a letter to General Santiago Mariño on December 16 from Valencia, where he states, I quote, "Our security and the reputation of the independent government impose on us, on the contrary, the duty to form a national body with New Granada. If we all unite into a single national body, while at the same time extinguishing the encouragement of disturbances, we will further consolidate our forces and make it easier for the people to cooperate in supporting their natural cause. Divided, we will be weaker, less respected by our enemies and neutrals. Union under a single supreme government will be our strength and will make us formidable to all." However, the Second Republic falls, led by Bolivar in 1814, and he is exiled in Kingston. Bolivar writes his prophetic letter, the famous letter from Jamaica, where he expresses the following regarding Colombia. New Granada will unite with Venezuela if they agree to form a central republic with Maracaibo as its capital, or a new city with the name Las Casas in honor of this hero of philanthropy. This nation would be called Colombia as a tribute of justice and gratitude to the creator of our hemisphere. Bolivar understood then that the fate of both nations had become united by the War of Independence, since it was in the interest of both countries. And in fact, they practiced mutual defense against the claims of the Spanish crown. And they would lose nothing if a political unity were consolidated between them. So Gran Colombia was born as a result of the War of Independence and the ideas planted by Miranda, which flourished in the genius of Bolivar. But it was still just an idea, not a reality. With this goal in mind, Bolivar undertakes the expedition of Los Cayos and lands in Barcelona on January 1, 1817. In the east, he defeats part of the royalist forces and manages to shape the government of the Republic of Venezuela, establishing the necessary conditions to later gather in Angostura del Orinoco, today Ciudad Bolivar, a congress that will change the destiny of Venezuela and New Granada. On February 15th, 1819, the Angostura Congress is established, where the liberator delivers one of his most iconic speeches, presenting his draft constitution. At the same time, the fundamental law of Colombia is drafted, whose first article reads as follows: "The republics of Venezuela and New Granada are from this day forward united as one under the glorious title of the Republic of Colombia." At the end of that year, 1819, those same men, together with the New Granadans, liberated New Granada from royalist rule. Thus, in February of 1820, that fundamental law of Colombia, which had initially been approved at the Congress of Angostura, was now enacted in New Granadan territory by General Francisco de Paula Santander, joining, yes, now officially, that Colombian Union, which had its origins in Venezuela in 1821, after several battles, difficulties, and once almost all of Venezuela had been liberated with the Battle of Carabobo. The Congress of Cucuta convened to give constitutional form to the Union of the Republic of Colombia, manages to meet and approves the Constitution of the Republic of Colombia in August. Colombia was thus divided into 7 departments: Orinoco, Zulia, Cundinamarca, Cauca, and Magdalena. Each of the departments would be divided into provinces. These provinces would be divided into cantons, and these into parishes. Each department would have its own intendant and each province its own governor. And Bogota was designated as the capital of that republic, the seat of the High Court of Justice, the Congress, the Senate, and the executive power. At the time of these events, Bolivar was appointed President of the Republic of Colombia and Santander, Vice President of the Union. After this, on October 9, Bolivar assumed extraordinary powers to undertake the Southern Campaign. The main objective of this campaign was to finish expelling the Royalists from the continent in order to guarantee the existence and security of Colombia. With this campaign, Bolivar freed Ecuador and Peru from Royalists and founded Bolivia. But while the liberator was winning these battles and glories, something was beginning to take shape in his hometown, a movement that would conspire against him and, moreover, threaten the integrity of the Union of the Republic of Colombia. From the moment the Republic of Colombia was born, legally, officially, and in fact with the Constitution of Cúcuta, Caracas municipality is full of plots and intrigue and protests in December 1821 against some of the precepts of that Colombian Magna Carta, arguing that, quote, it cannot be considered sanctioned by the same representatives who created it, nor impose on the people of this province and the Department of Quito the duty of strict and unalterable observance, when these people have had no part in its creation. This is what the Act of the Cabildo stated. In any case, the idea of the Republic of Colombia prevailed, and on January 3, 1822, the municipality of Caracas swore allegiance to the Republic of Colombia and agreed to adhere to the political administrative system that had been established in Cúcuta. However, as we said, the province of Caracas was not fully committed to the Union from the beginning. Their main grievance was that the Caracas patricians, that is, the Caracas elite, had not taken part in the discussions for the formation of Colombia that took place in Cúcuta in 1821, since at that time they were still under the control of the Spanish crown under royalist rule. They also disliked the department's intendant, a public office created by the Constitution and appointed directly by the executive in Bogota, thus diminishing what they considered their autonomy as a department. And finally, they viewed with suspicion that the capital of the republic was Bogota and not Caracas, a city that, from the very first moment of independence, and even since colonial times, had been the pioneering and most prominent voice in that struggle, and it held the reins of its own affairs. Discontent formed in the capital, which historians like Manuel Vicente Magallanes have called the Caracas Party, which over time would become the Separatist Party. This group would initially be made up of the few politicians from Caracas in the Congress of 1811, when the First Republic had been established, who had managed to survive that War of Independence and who, in their time, had advocated for the most radical ideas. Over time, the separatist movement and ideas gained ground in other regions and popularity in different sectors. To these politicians from Caracas were added former royalists who had supported the Spanish crown, their immediate descendants, and the historical adversaries of Bolivar. And so, little by little, the members of the Separatist Party, just like in colonial times, began to occupy positions in the municipalities, in the town councils, in the press, and in the courts. Are these parties understanding the Separatist Party as the evolution of the Caracas Party, differentiated by their respective purposes? In an initial phase, the Caracas Party advocated for a reform of the Constitution of Cúcuta that would allow the former Venezuela to regain its autonomy. Over time, several factions began to form within the Caracas Party. Federalists wanted to unite Venezuela, and New Granada under a decentralized government. Then there were the reformists who wanted the existence of the Colombian Union, but in a less centralized way than what was established in the Constitution of Cúcuta. And there were the separatists who sought the absolute independence of Venezuela and its separation from New Granada. After the events we are about to narrate, by 1829, the separatist tendency had already become hegemonic, and that's when we can properly speak of a separatist party. On the other hand, it's important to mention that in opposition to this party, there was also, both in Venezuela and throughout Colombia, the so-called Bolivarian Party, who saw in the liberator the necessary Caesar to consolidate the union of the republic. However, this Bolivarian Party would have a very passive role compared to that of its adversaries. So let's move on to see how in Venezuela the evolution of these groups of men takes place, who through their actions will radically change the destiny of that emerging republic established by the Constitution in Cúcuta for 1822. The person appointed to serve as the superior chief of the Department of Venezuela is General Carlos Zublek. Meanwhile, the position of military commander of the Department of Venezuela was held by a plainsman, General José Antonio Páez, who, for all practical purposes, was the one who actually had the undisputed leadership, not only of Caracas, but of almost all the departments that would make up the future Republic of Venezuela. Páez had been gaining his popularity for 5 years in the battles in the vastness of the plains, and above all, with the resounding triumph at the Battle of Carabobo. With that, he secured the respect and loyalty of the plainsmen and many others in Venezuela. They will follow him wherever their leader tells them to go. By 1824, Vice President Santander issued a decree ordering the departmental enlistment of militias with all men from 16 to 50 years old. Facing a possible resumption of hostilities with Spain in December of the same year, the municipality of Caracas refused to comply with that decree, arguing that these militias would not be under the command of the intendant, who was General Juan Manuel Escalona, but under the command of the military commander of Venezuela, who was José Antonio Páez. By December of that year, there was an attack on the Petare Military Park, and José Antonio Páez apprehended the assailants. He doesn't give them to Intendant Escalona, Department Head Carlos Zublek, or the Superior Court, but plans to judge them himself in a military court. This action by Páez is reported to the executive in Bogotá, which in February 1825 demands that he hand over the captives. Seeing these disagreements between Páez and the municipality of Caracas, and the municipality's disobedience to the recruitment decree from Bogotá, and some other violent events with guerrilla groups that were still loyal to the king, Santander sends a note to Congress warning about the growing problems and the atmosphere of unrest that existed in Caracas. At the same time, he denounces the existence of a party whose goal was, quote, to incite, in a word, the hatred of the masses against the institutions, laws, Congress, executive, and all kinds of authorities, unquote. In this sense, using extraordinary powers granted by Congress, powers to which the people of Caracas were opposed. Santander issued a decree on March 10, 1825, in which he granted more power to the military commander of Venezuela, who was Páez. These special powers were given to him for matters related to fighting guerrillas and combating conspirators. Who was, at first, the one legally entitled to receive those special powers that were granted to José Antonio Páez? The reaction of the Caracas municipality was immediate, and they found direct violations of the Colombian Constitution in the decree. It should be noted that at that time, Páez and the Caracas municipality had different objectives that did not coincide with each other. The Caracas municipality, although it did not dare to form a formal movement against the Colombian Union, was showing a growing tendency toward separation. And as for José Antonio Páez, the caudillo, warrior, and llanero, he cared little about getting involved in those political intrigues. as long as he maintained his military prestige and had the army under his command, whether under the flag of the Republic of Colombia or Venezuela. In this regard, on December 29, 1825, José Antonio Páez issued an order to enforce the militia enlistment decree that had been enacted by Santander. At that time, this decree had been forgotten and ignored by the municipality of Caracas, but Páez did this with the purpose of increasing the number of soldiers at his disposal. Few residents responded to that enlistment, and the call was renewed on January 6, 1826, with no more than 800 residents attending. This situation enraged Páez, who saw his authority vilified by the municipality of Caracas and other Caracas politicians who were working against the enlistment. So he threatened the journalists who were inciting people to disobey the enlistment decree. He even suggested eliminating freedom of the press. At the same time, he sent the Anzoátegui and Apure battalions to imprison any citizens they found in the streets with suspicious behavior. The intendant Juan Manuel Escalona, faced with this situation, intervened and managed to have the militia enlistment carried out peacefully on January 9th. Meanwhile, Intendant Escalona informs the executive in Bogotá and the municipality of Caracas about the incident. He joins the intendant's complaint regarding the attitude of José Antonio Páez, addressing the House of Representatives of the Republic of Colombia. All this results in the Senate of Colombia making a declaration. General José Antonio Páez was suspended from the military command of the Department of Venezuela on March 27, 1826. Santander, on his part, who, let's remember, is the vice president of the Republic and second in command to Bolivar, he appoints Intendant Juan Manuel Escalona to that position. He also summons Páez to appear before the Senate in Bogotá. Because of his actions in Caracas, José Antonio Páez calmly hands over his position to Escalona and for a moment considers appearing in Bogotá. So regarding what would later become the separatist movement known as the Cosiata, José Antonio Páez was the first, a so-called neutral figure who didn't support Venezuela's separation as long as he commanded his armed forces. In fact, at first he was the preferred target for attacks from the municipality of Caracas. What do you think of these? Páez was just another official of the Bogotá government. But all these events started to create two very clear feelings of discontent in General Páez. The first was a rejection of, quote, the jurists and lawyers of the municipalities, who, according to him, acted to the detriment of the military. And the second rejection was against the vice president, Santander, who not only appointed the intendant, he promoted Páez's accuser as the new military commander when he removed Páez from his position, and the technical reason for removing Páez. Furthermore, it was that he had enforced the conscription decree that Santander himself in Bogotá had enacted, and that the municipality of Caracas, in fact, had delayed in carrying out. In his autobiography, Páez recalls the events of 1826 as, I quote, a painful time, memories that still torment me, and I wish I could erase from my life, end quote. The truth is that during this painful time, Páez planned to appear before the Senate of Colombia before he actually did. A peculiar man arrives, one of the same scholars he used to reject, to invite him to disobey the laws of Colombia and not to appear before anyone in distant Bogotá. It was Dr. Miguel Peña, an eminent jurist, a scholar who played a notable role in the independence with a great capacity for political maneuvering and a well-known man of intrigue and Machiavellian schemes, as will be seen. Since the influence that Dr. Miguel Peña had on José Antonio Páez would be decisive in the development of Venezuela's separation from the Colombian Union. Miguel Peña, as noted, had remarkable legal intelligence and was naturally astute, talkative, calculating, and detail-oriented. Bolivar himself said to Santander, quote, Dr. Peña is a sharp man, talented, bold, and it is very important that you keep him close to the government. flattered with the hope of a high destiny, and under no pretext should he go to Venezuela, so that the homeland, you and I, will not have something to mourn someday. It happens that Dr. Miguel Peña had been a member of the High Court of Justice of Colombia in Bogotá between 1821 and 1825. But as a result of two problems that occurred at that time, at Santander's request, the Senate was going to summon him, accusing him of embezzlement of public funds and illicit enrichment. But Dr. Miguel Peña left for Valencia to avoid appearing. Dr. Peña and José Antonio Páez met in Valencia, where Dr. Peña, through his courtly skill, won the favor of the Centaur of the Plains and became his advisor. They will get along, among other things, because Páez already had a rejection towards the jurists and lawyers and against the vice president, Santander. And did Dr. Peña offer him the chance to strike back against Santander and everything he had done to him back in Bogotá? Next, the events of April 27, 1826. The municipality of Valencia, the city where Páez was living, holds an extraordinary council meeting to discuss several matters related to the precarious situation of the army. For a moment, it was believed that the council meeting had ended, until one of the council members brought up the issue of the upcoming appearance that former Commander Páez had to make in Bogotá. In light of this, the municipality questioned whether Páez's dismissal could be suspended. To that end, they consulted lawyers José Antonio Borges, Geronimo Windy Voxel, and Miguel Peña, and all three concluded that nothing could be done to reverse the dismissal, just as the summons order could not be annulled. But when everything seemed to be over, a sudden wave of violence broke out in the city of Valencia, presumably orchestrated by those who wanted to carry out the rebellion. And in the midst of the chaos, 3 people are murdered and multiple robberies and armed assaults are committed. The situation of chaos makes Páez appear as the one capable of imposing peace and tranquility. Therefore, on April 30th, the Cabildo meets again, now with the firm conviction to carry out the rebellion, arguing the people's discontent over Páez's removal as commander. To that end, the Cabildo of Valencia summons the governor of the province, Don Fernando Peñalver, to ask him to reinstate Páez in his position as commander. Fernando Peñalver refuses and confronts Francisco Carabaño, chief of staff, and involved in the conspiracy, so that he would fulfill his duty to maintain order and stop the conspiracy being led by José Antonio Páez. Carabaño, chief of staff, and the other conspirators respond to Peñalver with shouts and head out into the street toward Páez's residence to move him, amid cheers. From the municipality, the Cosiata movement was formally and openly born, with Páez present in the council. The council approves his reinstatement as military commander of Venezuela, and Páez, without thinking twice, accepts his old position again, swearing to disobey any orders that from now on come from Bogotá at the request of the Valencia Council, as well as the municipalities of other cities such as Maracay, Calabozo, and even Caracas, which until recently was opposed to Páez for carrying out the decrees proclaimed in Bogotá. They end up supporting his appointment as military commander of Venezuela, since they saw in him a possibility to increase their influence in the already growing separatist movement. He had achieved this so well that he also represented the interests of lawyers, jurists, and legal scholars, and the same municipality of Caracas to fulfill its own interests, to split Venezuela from Gran Colombia, becoming, without necessarily planning it, the visible leader of the La Cosiata movement that sought Venezuela's independence from the Colombian Union. A few days later, on May 11, Páez, advised by Dr. Peña, attends an assembly in Valencia, where it is agreed to make an appeal to the liberator Simón Bolívar to ratify Páez as the civil and military leader of Venezuela, thus move forward with a national convention to adapt the Constitution of Cúcuta to Venezuela's customs and circumstances. 3 days later, on May 14, Páez is sworn in as military commander, and 15 days after that, on May 29, he repeats the oath at the municipality of Caracas in the presence of the authorities of the Department of Venezuela. Thus, Páez attains the highest Republican honor, the military command, which, for all practical purposes, was the force in charge and the one capable of making any political movement in that region succeed or fail. At the same time, as we mentioned, he gains the Caracas Party, which was already turning into the Separatist Party, a figure under which to protect their interests, whether intentionally or unintentionally, even though the name of the Colombian Union and Simón Bolívar were still being invoked. The truth is that the events in Valencia represent a break in the thread of Caracas's subordination to the central Colombian government. From then on, what happens is a progressive deterioration of the relationship between Caracas and Bogotá in the following months, during which he was reinstated as military commander. Páez exercises power without regard for any law, legislating and ordering whatever he considered right for the proper management of public administration. Closely advised by Dr. Peña, on October 2, 1826, the municipality of Caracas meets and decides to hasten the formation of that great constituent convention of Colombia. And in addition, it commissions the new intendant, Cristobal Mendoza, to convene a full assembly for the adoption of a federal system in Venezuela. Thus, this assembly is installed on October 5 at the San Francisco convent, and the intention to adopt the federal system is unanimously ratified. It is agreed not to alter or disobey the laws of Colombia, unless it becomes necessary. And furthermore, a provincial assembly is called for November, with the aim of making a request to the Congress of Colombia to hold the Gran Constituent Convention in order to reform the Constitution of Cúcuta. In this sense, on November 1st, the Provincial Assembly takes place with representatives from the entire Department of Venezuela, and it is presided over by the intendant Cristobal Mendoza. In this assembly, the most radical and separatist faction, who wanted absolute independence, openly emerges, arguing that Colombia was already effectively dissolved and that there was no sense in continuing to obey a government that no longer existed, and that there was no point in waiting for a constituent convention that was not going to take place anyway. The leader of that faction, Juan Iribarren, attacks the president of Colombia, Simón Bolívar, saying that he was against constitutional reform and that he wanted to undermine the freedom of Caracas. In response to this situation, the instructions sent by the liberator from Lima are read. Faced with that situation, the liberator was quite far away in a very complex and difficult situation in the city of Lima. He sends instructions stating he does not oppose the reform. Instead, he wants to speed it up to end Colombia's civil dissensions. This calms the spirits of the Provincial Assembly, which finally decides to peacefully send a representation to the Congress of Colombia so that it could take place and they could participate in that constituent convention. But those most strongly favored full independence and separating Venezuela from Colombia. They are not satisfied and decide to form a popular assembly in Caracas on November 7 to demand a Venezuelan federation without consulting the government. In Bogotá, José Antonio Páez, accompanied by Dr. Peña, takes part in that debate. And he recalls that on April 30, he had sworn not to obey any order from Bogotá and that he would keep his oath. At the same time, he says that if the people of Caracas were determined to pursue a definitive separation, he would not stand in their way. This popular assembly decides that Páez should have organized the electoral colleges provided for in the Constitution of Cúcuta to form the Venezuelan Constituent Congress. With the intention of formally separating Venezuela from Gran Colombia, José Antonio Páez thus decrees that by December 10 of the same year, 1826, the electoral colleges must convene to begin their sessions on January 10, 1827. But when December arrived, various violent skirmishes broke out between the more radical separatists and the Bolivarians, who still defended the Colombian Union project. The Bolivarians viewed the municipalities of Caracas and Valencia as betraying the liberator Bolivar. As these conflicts intensified, the country found itself on the brink of a possible conflict or civil war. But in mid-December 1826, news arrived that Simón Bolívar, distressed by the situation in Venezuela, was already making preparations to go to Caracas to resolve those conflicts. As soon as it was known in Caracas about the imminent arrival of the liberator, the separatists halted their assemblies, and those who supported the separation of Venezuela, like José Antonio Páez, instead hurried to celebrate the imminent arrival of Bolívar in the country. Simón Bolívar arrives in Puerto Cabello on December 31 and January 1, 1827, as President of Colombia. He issues a decree stating no one shall be persecuted or judged for the acts, speeches, or opinions that have been made in connection with the reforms, thus granting a pardon to all those involved in the events of 1826 and confirming Páez as the supreme leader of Venezuela, both in civil and military matters. To this effect, Páez, always advised by Dr. Peña, issues a decree from Valencia in which he establishes that from this moment on, the authority of His Excellency is recognized and will be obeyed in its entirety. The liberator, in his capacity as President of the Republic, on January 13th, a few days later, the city of Caracas once again welcomes Bolívar, and celebrations are held with banquets in honor of the return of Caracas's most illustrious son. In Venezuela, the situation was very precarious from every perspective, so Bolívar dedicated himself energetically from the government to attending to all kinds of matters. The historian José Gil Fortul said Venezuela's union with New Granada was more a cause of delay than progress. Agriculture was destroyed. The universities produced neither knowledge nor income. The public administration had empty coffers, and justice was only reflected on paper. Bolívar does his best to address these issues, but by July, he must leave Venezuela for other matters and never returns to his homeland. He is called away by the other problems of Colombia, which kept growing and were leading the state toward anarchy. The Cosiata separatist movement was not the sole factor showing Gran Colombia's disintegration. Other events of various kinds contributed to the premature demise of the Colombian Union in January 1827. In the departments of Quito, Guayaquil, and Azuay, some skirmishes and uprisings broke out that disregarded Colombian laws and claimed to accept only the authority of Bolívar, who, if he did not convene the much-anticipated Constituent Congress or Great Convention, in the language of that era, they planned to become independent states. The Congress of Colombia, as Bolívar had to do with Venezuela, offers pardons and seeks to remedy the situation with these departments in order to enforce its authority amid this growing anarchy, while Bolívar was still calming tempers in Venezuela. In February 1827, Bolívar decided to submit his resignation as president of Colombia to Congress. And although Santander's supporters in Congress try to get the motion approved, Congress rejects the resignation, and Bolívar remains president. Even so, from within Congress itself, various factions will make every effort to censure and reject all the extraordinary decrees that the liberator will issue in the exercise of his powers. So, as we said, in the midst of growing problems, Bolívar leaves Venezuela and returns to Bogotá in September 1827 to take the reins of Colombia after his long absence. But Bolívar does not find the encouraging outlook of 1821 when he went south. Instead, he encounters an increasingly strong and organized opposition party. This party called itself Liberal or Santanderist, and referred to Bolivar's followers as godos, or serviles. The leadership of this Santanderist party was headed by the very vice president of the Republic, Santander, also by doctors Vicente Azuero and Francisco Soto. They promote all kinds of propaganda and hatred against Simón Bolívar, portraying him as someone prone to tyranny, military despotism, and as an enemy of the law. In particular, Santander and Azuero flooded the press of New Granada with articles attacking the actions of the liberator. The historian José María Groot summarizes the situation in that region with the following words. A lot of work had been done by the party to ruin the liberator's reputation both outside and inside the chambers, either through newspapers or through pamphlets written in a virulent style, and others pretending to be impartial, and finally through speeches at private gatherings. The boldness was great at that time. Wasn't the liberator already being called nothing but tyrant in gatherings and on the streets? And even applying ridiculous epithets to him. There had previously been a despicable madman in Bogotá who used to walk around dressed in military rags, and they called him Longaniza. They compared the liberator to this man, calling him by the same name, mainly the students who followed Azuero. The truth is that the situation in Gran Colombia, from the Orinoco to the mountains of Ecuador, was problematic everywhere, and various groups were beginning to see Bolívar as a common enemy. So the vast majority of political actors on the scene agreed that, in order to solve the problems, the Grand Convention to change the 1821 Cúcuta Constitution needed to be held as soon as possible. To this end, the final months of 1827 were used to carry out the necessary formalities for the installation of this constitutional convention, which would include representatives from all the departments of the Republic of Colombia. The convention was held in the canton of Ocaña and began its sessions on April 9, 1828. Thus, in Ocaña, two prominent blocs emerged at that convention: the Centralists or Bolivarians, who advocated for the existence of a single strong and vigorous republic led by Simón Bolívar, so that this republic could confront local anarchies. And there were the Federalists under the direct tutelage of Santander, who was at the same time the right-hand man as president and also the #1 enemy of Simón Bolívar. Santander aims to speed up these divisions, but the convention was a reflection of the growing state of disintegration of that republic, and the delegates could not reach an agreement on the issues. There were plenty of shouting and insults among the different factions, and this, as could be expected, ended in total disagreement at that convention, with even a threat of civil war within Colombia. Simón Bolívar, paying close attention to the convention from Bucaramanga, faced with the serious threat of civil war and growing anarchy, decides to intervene in the situation as president of Colombia. On June 24th, he resolves the effects of the Convention of Ocaña and is supported by several municipalities of the nation, including those of Caracas. He swears, together with Páez, absolute obedience to himself, decides to exercise the supreme command of the Republic, eliminating the vice presidency and Congress, and only leaving two bodies to assist him in his mission to restore peace and unity to the Republic: the Council of Ministers and the Council of State. These measures are applauded in the squares of many municipalities of Gran Colombia, while in other sectors they are rejected. Thus began the so-called Dictatorship of Bolivar in 1828, whose decrees would increase separatist desires among his opposition. Among the measures enacted by Bolivar during this period, which have been widely debated by everyone, historians highlight the increase in military jurisdiction, the imposition of Catholicism as the state religion, the re-establishment of Catholic convents, the suspension of freedom of the press, the elimination of municipalities, and the prohibition of secret societies such as Freemasonry. All of this, according to the Bolivarians, was to restore order and unity to the Republic in the face of a growing threat of civil war. One of these secret groups is the one that in September of that year tried to force their way into the place where Simón Bolívar was staying. To kill himself and assassinate the president, but the liberator manages to escape from his near assassination in what became known as the September Conspiracy. However, while that New Granadan opposition was acting against Bolivar, even seeking to assassinate the head of state, what was happening in Venezuela, which just 2 years ago had been showing incessant desires for a change in its organization? The truth is that these days Venezuelans are only interested in what they can do in favor of their local autonomy, whether under the flag of Colombia or not. At first glance, it seemed like a contradictory stance compared to the one taken during the year 1826. The truth is, with Bolivar as the Union's supreme leader, there is no Congress or municipalities. There was little that could formally be done to pull the strings in favor of a separation. That's why, after the convention of Ocaña failed, they appealed to recognize the supreme authority of Bolivar, hoping that they could obtain from him the autonomy they so greatly desired. In turn, before the end of that year, 1828, the New Granadians José Hilario López and José María Obando had risen up in Popayan. And in addition, there was a war underway with Peru due to their invasion of Colombian territory. To this heavy war situation was added Colombia's economic situation, which, despite loans and debts, its political instability prevented it from achieving proper agricultural, industrial, and economic development. In December 1828, Simón Bolívar set January 2nd, 1830 as the date for a new and upcoming Constituent Congress and reaffirmed his dictatorship. Until this Congress was installed, thus began a fateful year, 1829, which did not pass in peace at all. The war with Peru had not ended when another insurrection broke out, this time led by José María Córdoba in Antioquia. Peru is eventually defeated, and Córdoba's Antioquia uprising is crushed. Despite everything, Bolívar's dictatorship becomes relatively stable. This opens up a small space to think about the constitutional and political form that would be adopted at the end of Bolívar's dictatorship. This leads to renewed quarrels between Federalists, Centralists, and even a few who, in order to achieve order in Colombia, wanted to establish a monarchy. For this purpose, popular assemblies and congresses are held throughout Colombia so that each of them could submit their proposals to the Constituent Congress. In the case of Valencia, this popular assembly is held on November 23, where they gather with the approval of Páez. There, Páez, without directly getting involved in the matter, he reads to them the orders given by the liberator from Guayaquil, in which it was stipulated that in that assembly they could approve anything they considered appropriate and necessary. In that sense, in that assembly they decide that Venezuela must completely separate from New Granada and Quito. They argued that the same laws were not suitable for the customs and situations of each of those territories, and that the vast territorial extension of these departments made unified administration difficult. It is thus up to the future constitutional delegates to bring this resolution to Congress in order to achieve independence and separation through peaceful means. Such a proclamation and declaration at the Popular Assembly of Valencia was the echo of the undisputed triumph of the separatist movement in Venezuela, prevailing over the reformist and federalist tendencies. It was also clear evidence of the defeat of Bolivar in Venezuela. What began in Caracas in 1821 had now been formalized in Valencia, but it still had to end inevitably in Caracas, that turbulent year of 1829. 2 days after the Assembly of Valencia, on November 26, the People's Assembly, held at the San Francisco Convent in Caracas, decided to reject the authority of General Bolivar. Number 2, to continue peaceful and friendly relations with the central and southern departments of Colombia. Number 3, the prompt formation of a constituent Congress that includes the departments of the former captaincy of Venezuela. Number 4, to appoint General José Antonio Páez as the supreme leader of all Venezuelan departments. After this, in December, a campaign against Bolivar breaks out in Venezuela, and all kinds of pamphlets and newspapers circulate along the central coast, attacking the figure of the man they recently proclaimed as the liberator. Then on December 27, the Assembly of the San Francisco Convent in Caracas ratifies that resolution from November 26, and it adds a clause about the immediate, absolute, and non-negotiable separation of Venezuela from the Colombian Union. The decision had already been made. It only needed to be heard by the liberator. As Bolivar had foreseen in 1828, the new Constituent Congress began its sessions in January 1830 in Bogota. Even though Venezuela's separation was more than a fact, Bolivar believed that a peaceful reconciliation could still be achieved in this Congress. To this end, Bolivar tried to travel to Mérida to confer with José Antonio Páez, but the Congress forbade him. And instead, in April, the Cúcuta conferences were held, which was the border point between Venezuela and New Granada. And what about the border that Páez had set up for the commissioners from Bogota of the Colombian Union, so they couldn't go past there? The commissioners from Bogota went with the intention of offering a friendly agreement in which Venezuela would remain under the Republic of Colombia. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan commissioners were going to explain and justify absolute independence and separation from that union. And just like at the Convention of Ocaña, the conferences in Cúcuta between both groups were fruitless and ended on April 22, 1830. Bolivar resigned from the presidency in March as stipulated at the start of his dictatorship, and he was waiting for Congress to finish a new constitution to offer it to the Venezuelans as a last attempt to achieve independence. But the Venezuelans rejected this constitution in May, since they already had a date for the meeting of the Venezuelan Constituent Congress, which would choose a new constitution only for Venezuela. Thus, on September 22, the Constitution of the State of Venezuela of 1830 was officially enacted, whose Article number 5 reads as follows. The territory of Venezuela includes everything that before the political transformation of 1810 was called the Captaincy General of Venezuela. Thus, in this way, the Republic of Venezuela was born, which continues to exist to this day, and its separation from the Republic of Colombia, which had been born at the Congress of Angostura in 1819, was made official. As for Bolivar, does he live long enough to see the dismantling of his work? He mourns Marshal Sucre's assassination, seeing him as the last hope for reconciling Colombians. He suffers from the inaction of the government in Bogota, sees with his own eyes the disappearance of his fortune, and then falls seriously ill at the end of that year, being forced to retire to Santa Marta. He died on December 17, 1830, and with him also died the idea of the Colombian Union, a project to which he dedicated nothing less than the last words of his will, which read, "If my death contributes to ending the factions and consolidating the Union, I will go peacefully to the grave." As for Páez and absolute autonomy for Venezuela, they will see their project fulfilled, although they will face a nation without industry, without agriculture, very agitated socially and politically, and lacking in law. So it will be up to Páez, as historian Tomás Polanco Alcántara called him, to be the founder of the Republic, create institutions, organize the treasury, promote the fine arts, and be, in a word, part of the country's destiny. Until the middle of the 19th century, even now reactions to the project's end are either applause or melancholy, which gave rise to the new political tradition of an independent Venezuela and a new Granada, later called independent Colombia. For some, The Gran Colombian project was simply unfeasible. For others, it was the only way to form a powerful state that could be treated as an equal by the rest of the nations on the planet. Some point out that Venezuela, under Gran Colombia, did not occupy the position it deserved in the Union, while others claim that there were autonomous interests among Venezuelans who were not going to accept being governed by anyone else. The truth is that, beyond individual ambitions and actions, this separation was an organic process in which a multitude of factors played a role, and that ultimately separated the destinies of Venezuela from those of Colombia. A national project that had become unworkable and was dissolved so that they could later form their own destinies, very much at the cost of having been that failed project, the work of the greatest of its sons, the liberator Simón Bolívar. Thank you for watching this video. Your support means a lot to us. By leaving your comments, giving it a like, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with all your acquaintances, and clicking the bell to activate notifications. This was Reynaldo José Carrillo Vilches speaking to you. This is the New Encyclopedia. As always, we thank you for all your support and many blessings to everyone.